now with part 2 of today's meeting. Supply. And supply simply represents the producers, we sometimes call them suppliers' willingness to supply a particular quantity at a given price. So we have here the concept of quantity supplied, and the concept is identical in logic to the concept of quantity demanded. All right? So you have supply could be represented in 3 major forms, right? Fast learners, number 1.
Chart, graph.
Yeah.
Table.
Table.
Graph.
Table is sometimes the same as schedule. Number 2 will be graph, usually in the form of a curve. And number 3 will be in the form of a function. Okay? Very simple. Sometimes supply is just standing short for supply function. So supply or supply function provides the relationship between the price of a product and the quantity which producers are willing to offer or supply on the market for sale at that price. Alright, that's fairly straightforward. Let's see. Quantity supplied. Then you have factors which determine supply. In other words, what does the supply depend on? And the first one is the price. Let's clarify immediately. When the price changes, we move along the supply curve. When any of the other factors changes, the supply curve will shift, say. So we just say shift. When we don't know up or down, we just say supply changes or supply shifts. Well, if we know it's positive, supply increases. If we know it's negative, supply decreases. So what will be the typical factors affecting supply?
Demand.
Demand.
No, we usually assume, so demand is not typically a factor, simply because, how much people demand it is not related to the supply, okay?
Price of the input.
Now, if demand increases, increasing demand may result in a higher price. And because demand changes the equilibrium price, you may have secondary effects on the quantity supplied at the higher price. You understand the difference? So, because demand increased, the price will increase. And because the price increased, the quantity supplied will increase. But it doesn't mean that the supply itself increases. So, something else.
Technology.
Technology, yes. We start with this, technology. Well, what was that fancy technology which Saudi Arabia has been increasingly using over the last 2 decades in oil, when they pump deeper, and then they use horizontal oil wells. This is a fairly new technological advancement where you don't just pump down, drill down, and then try to suck the oil, but it has a horizontal leg. So it moves down, then a horizontal leg, and sucks the oil from the side. Then it moves into the second direction, into a third direction. So, horizontal oil well technology is an example of being able to produce more at the same price. Well, of course, technology itself is also costly, so it is a capital, and it requires sometimes more capital. It is subject to capital requirements rules, like capital budgeting. That has net positive value, so you provide what's in corporate finance, capital budgeting decisions. But otherwise, in general, technology will allow to produce more at a certain price.
So you could supply more.
Yes, you supply more at the same price. Seismic technology is another example. Seismic means it measures the shaking, the moving, the trembling of the earth. So based on seismic measurements, you have better ways to allocate exactly where there might be oil and where there might not be oil. So you're sitting on the one side, you're sitting on the other side, you put these sounds, they tremble a little bit, and based on the trembling, on the vibrations, you measure, oh, based on these vibrations, there probably is oil or there probably is no oil. So, due to, with the help of seismic measurements and etc., technology, you can actually locate the oil better, exactly where it is. They say, drill here. If you drill 100 meters away, it won't flow. I'm just providing examples with oil technology. We can come up with more, but not necessary. In general, it's just a common sense concept that if your computer works 50 times faster, you take a modern day computer as opposed to a 15-year-old computer, you're going to be getting a lot more work. I mean, imagine if I was using a 15-year-old computer to compress, to download and compress this video, we'll talk like 300 megabytes. 15 years ago, you don't have a hard drive of 300 megabytes. This was the whole hard drive. Well, I'm talking about 1991. Hard drive like 20, well, there was no even concept of a hard drive, just used tape, all right? So, technology moves. Now, we can actually produce quite a few videos during the day and during the lectures. Before that will be possible. Next factor.
Expectations? I'm sorry.
Again, same old story. Expectations are always factored in. Now, in business, but especially in finance and investments, expectations are a little tricky. You expect the price to go up, what do? Well, you supply more to profit out of the higher price. But then again, you expect the price to go up, what do? You withhold some of the supply today to sell it later at a higher price. So sometimes it's actually very tricky. You have to think, and when you're thinking of supply, are you thinking of the current supply or are you thinking of the future supply? Okay? So you also have to think of expectations, because expectations will have different changes in the supply now, in the current period, versus the supply future in the next period. Okay? So sometimes when they expect substantially higher price, they'll actually do both. They will withhold the supply today, but as they withhold the supply today, they will also plan to produce even more next time. Okay, so rather than producing 100 now and 100 next year, they'll produce now maybe even 110. Offer only 80, keep the other 30 in reserve, and then offer again, produce 110, and then try to sell all 140, hopefully, for a lot higher price. So, very tricky, but you must always keep in mind what the expectations are. Of course, the hardest part is to figure out what the expectations are. I mean, how do you figure out what's going to be, what are the expectations for the price of oil next year? You can't know. I mean, you can use all the fanciest econometrics in the world, and you get some sort of a disease or whatnot, and demand collapses and oil price collapses. Or you get yourself an war, and price triples. Again, it depends on 1,001 different things, okay? So, expectations are very tricky to measure. That's the point. Very hard to measure. Next.
The prices of goods related.
Oh, okay. So, related, that's how we call it. Related prices. Related prices, well, for supply, does it also, it actually should also have, let's put in here costs. I mean, these are important, costs. So, cost is what we call prices of inputs. This is a lot nicer. So, an input is something which is used in the production of something else. Alright? The most common example, of course, is gasoline, for which the input is crude oil, right? A whole bunch of other things. For bread, the input is flour, and for flour, the input is wheat. And for the production of wheat, the input could be, let's say, fertilizer, for example, all those things. So, if the price of inputs goes down, and again, other things equal, price, technology, everything else staying the same. If other things stay the same, but the input, the price goes down, overall supply will increase. This is perfectly logical. And, of course, the opposite is also true. If the price of the input, which we simply call cost, which we just call cost, goes up, of course, other things remaining the same, then the supply will shift to the left. Now, let's try this before I'm done here with the factors. I used this basic concept of other things being equal is effectively one of the most common assumptions in economics. This meaning also other things remaining the same, meaning all the other factors did not change. In economics, it has a very special name. We call it ceteris paribus, which is not English, it is Latin, and is used in Latin, is directly borrowed in English. In ceteris paribus, in Latin will be ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus simply means other things being the same, or other things remaining constant. Equal is the same as constant. Or other things remain unchanged. Alright, so costs will be an important factor, other things remaining the same. Alright? One of the classic examples that we even have today in the United States is as prices of gasoline have not responded to increasing oil prices, what happens? Suppliers, meaning refiners, buy less crude oil and refine less of it into gasoline. So the supply of gasoline is shrinking when the price does not change too much of a gasoline, but the price of the input, meaning the price of crude oil, actually goes up. Alright? Well, one of the results is shortages. I'll get to this fairly soon. Okay, so technology, the complements, substitutes. Alright. Also, let's try now this related prices. Related prices will be, let's say, substitutes in production. What is a substitute in production? Well, a substitute in production is you may have for tarts, sweet stuff, you have what's called sweeteners. the natural sweetener that we all humans know. Well, it's not the perfectly natural, it's just sugar, all right? The natural sweeteners for humans come from fruits, right? Fruits represent the natural sweeteners, all right? We call these monosaccharides, all right? So, sugar is disaccharides, and artificials will be polysaccharides, okay? So, sugar represents for us a natural sweetener. If we get to have a much cheaper artificial sweetener, suddenly those products which are intensive or consume a lot of sugar, and all of those sweets that we eat, they actually consume an awful lot of sugar. Sugar remains a major cost. If you can find a substitute for sugar, and that substitute is a lot cheaper, then it begins to make a lot of sense, possibly to substitute sugar with something else, as long as it tastes okay, similarly, okay? For example, in the United States and in Bulgaria, Coke tastes very differently. Like Pepsi tastes very different. Why? Because strong competitive pressures in the United States force companies to replace natural sugar with... Yes, they're not truly artificial. It's called corn syrup. Corn syrup is still a natural sweetener made out of corn. Alright? So, it's a whole lot cheaper and doesn't taste as good. But, you know, change it for a while, and 3-6 months down the road, American consumers forget the taste of original, real Coca-Cola. Alright? So that's an example of it. Okay? Let's see what else. Do we have more factors, or we're done with factors?
Yeah, the capacity of the production.
Oh, production, yes, of course. This is one of the most important concepts. Okay, let's do this. Production capacity. Production capacity, of course, for oil is remarkably limited. Here's the trick. There may be thousands of, or hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil. But Saudi Arabia can barely produce 9 million, and that's it. And even if it wants, it can't just increase it to 11. That's because the capacity itself is limited, all right? There is plenty of oil, but it can't just produce double, if you wish, or triple, if you wish. Why? Well, it takes an awful lot of things. You gotta have to have the oil, the oil well, right? You gotta have it on top and everything else. But then there's some other problem, like pressure. Oil, sometimes, well, most of the times in Saudi Arabia flows out of its oil on its own. It has its own pressure. Well, if pressure is limited, it can push up so much oil, okay? So if pressure is low, you can have 10 wells, but it's still going to flow slow. Oh, but now you gotta have water flooding technology. Oops, that's number 2. You introduce the technology. You inject water on each side or on different sides, and water comes from underneath and starts pushing the oil up. Alright? Because water is heavy and oil is light. So start pushing it up, and if you put pressure through the water, it will increase that. But then you get other problems like water flooding. Once the water breaks through the oil and goes straight to the well, all that you produce is water. Alright? So suddenly you get into other risks. So you can't push water too much or too hard, because you have to keep undamaged the contact surface between oil and water. Otherwise, you push too hard, it can break through, and then it's game over for that particular oil well. And the oil could remain trapped in that area, which will require a brand new well and digging and everything else to finally get it extracted. Back to production capacity. So, production capacity in oftentimes limits. Well, think of just producing cars. You got so much capacity, you got an assembly line, you can produce maybe 500 cars a day. Well, you can work 2 shifts, you can work 3 shifts, you can increase it to 1,500 cars, and that's it. You can't just increase to 60. Shockingly simple. Question?
It's not a question, it's common. There is the Nintendo Wii, the game, Nintendo Wii.
Yeah, Nintendo, okay.
There is so much demand for it, and the supply is not enough, so they are pulling their ads from the TV because it doesn't make sense, you know, like...
Yeah, why
out of the
spend
market.
more? Yes, simply because Nintendo does not have, your point I guess is,
capacity.
does not have the production capacity to produce more.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, that's oftentimes true. A lot of times this is a sales or marketing trick where they originally limit artificially the quantity supplied for the early periods so that they can drive the price higher and profit a lot more, and as demand goes up and consumers heat up because, oh, you can't get it, you gotta get it, you gotta get it now, you gotta buy it whenever you see it. You know, once you psych up the consumers, then they begin to flood as much as they can the market and essentially sell thousands, more like millions of them, and the consumers in a couple of weeks don't figure out that the market was actually flooded. But these techniques you'll study not in this course, but in marketing. These are tricks to trick the consumer. That's what MBA is all about. You got to trick the consumer every time you can. So, capacity. The concept of capacity is the most fundamental concept behind the bigger concept which currently concerns the whole humanity, the concept of peak oil. Peak oil is one of the most misunderstood concepts, usually because Western media like to misrepresent it to consumers and to everybody, and therefore everyone gets the wrong message. Peak oil simply says not that we are running out of oil. There is plenty of it. It simply says that for 24 hours, the whole human civilization can produce 85, and that's it. You can try some more, but you can't. You can't increase. And this is about what is called the rate of production. The rate of production. And rate of production, of course, in physics and mechanics, and of course in economics, we have a special word for it. It's called flow. In other words, the real problem is not that the oil is not there. The real problem is that we have so many oil wells and they can pump so much. And we can't just add some more. And the problem is we are actually adding a lot more. That's true. We can add 10, 15% more during the year. But you also have a lot of oil wells for which you have a natural decline. I mean, an oil well, you start pumping. Within 2, 3, 4 years, you maximize the total quantity, meaning the flow that you can pump. And then slowly but gradually, it falls off. In other words, you ramp up production, and then it slowly falls off. And you may get some oil fields that they can be slowly slowing off for, the ramp up could be 20, 30 years if it's a big oil field, or the slow down could be 30 to 40 years, right? An example of oil field which has been ramping up for many years and now is beginning to peak and slow now is, how do we call it? What's the biggest oil field in Saudi Arabia? Gawar. All right. Gawar. All right. G-H. How do you pronounce it? Gawar. Okay, there you have it. So as an example, Gawar is right about now peaking. Well, actually, you have the northern, the northern, one of them already peaked, the other one is still ramping up. Overall, it's holding constant, etc. So it is about the flow. And back to it is about the capacity to produce. Not that it's not there. It actually means that as the rate slows down, rather than at current production rates running out in 40 years when run out in 100 or 150 years or 200 years, all right? Well, of course, they're never going to be true running out, because once we observe that you begin, to deplete substantially, everyone who has it will be producing less and less and less of it to conserve more and more. All right? Fairly clear? All right. What's next about production? Substitutes in production. Okay. Complements in production. That's fairly standard. Okay. Determinants of supply. Okay. Let's try to clarify this, which is sometimes confusing. When I say factors of supply or factors of demand, the textbook says determinants. It is the same thing. So, determinants of supply, factors of supply is the same thing. It simply is a variable which will change the supply or the quantity supplied. Supply schedule, supply curve. The next concept of supply schedule and supply curve, the next concept is inverse, right? Inverse, how do we call it? Supply function. So, we also have here supply function. Supply function will be, what will be supply function? Wasn't it quantity supplied? As a function of price. Well, here is going to be price as a function, but of course it's a different function, so I'm just changing F to G of
Q.
Quantity. Okay? So price is a function of quantity. Fairly straightforward. It applies the same identical logic. All right. Absolutely using the same logic. That's my mistake. That's my mistake. Supply curves are always upward sloping. All right? Supply curves are always upward sloping. In other words, when the price increases, suppliers are always willing to offer higher quantity at the same price. In other words, quantity supplied increases with price. So, we say this, the law of supply. So, the law of supply says that the supply curve is upward sloping. Okay, a different way of saying it is that as the price increases, suppliers are willing to offer more on the market. Alright? A third way of saying the same thing is that price and quantity are positively related. Alright? That's fairly straightforward. The next concept is increase in supply. Increase in supply means for the same price, the quantity supplied increases. So, you're going to have a particular price increases, and if it increases means the price remains the same. So, here you have Q1, now you have Q2. So, for the same price, you have instead of Q1, Q2 bigger than, larger than Q1. Alright, that's for one. Then, for another one similarly, and then supply curve shifts to the right, means that for every price, the quantity supplied increases. We also say that the supply increases. Shift to the supply curve could be to the left or could be to the right. Shifting to the right means supply increases. Shifting to the left means supply decreases. Fairly straightforward, right? Let's see what else we have. Again, the logic for supply is practically the same, is almost identical. So supply is always a lot easier to study once we have studied demand. Let's see if there's anything left. No, nothing is left, so we're taking a 10-minute break, okay? Oh, thank you.